The amplifier went silent. Jimi smiled. And the next 20 minutes changed everything. Olympic Studios. Barnes, London. April 1967. Studio A had seen some of the greatest recordings in British rock history pass through its doors, but tonight the air felt different. Heavier. The kind of weight that comes before something breaks. Jimi Hendrix sat on a wooden stool in the center of the room, his Stratocaster resting across his lap. Around him, the usual constellation of a recording session. Microphone stands, tangled cables, sheet music scattered across music stands, the red recording light glowing above the control room window. The session had started 3 hours ago. They were working on a new track, something experimental, something that pushed beyond what anyone expected rock music could sound like. Jimi had been layering guitar parts, building textures, creating sounds that seemed to come from somewhere other than the instrument in his hands. And then the engineer stopped the tape. His name was Gerald Morrison. 42 years old. 15 years of experience recording everyone from classical orchestras to jazz quartets to the occasional rock band that EMI sent his way. He knew sound. He knew equipment. He knew the rules. And Jimi Hendrix was breaking all of them. Mr. Hendrix. Gerald's voice came through the control room speaker, clipped and precise. We need to discuss the levels. Jimi looked up slowly. Didn't speak. Just waited. The volume it's simply too much. The meters are peaking constantly. We're getting distortion that's going to ruin the master tape. I need you to turn down. In the control room, Chaz Chandler, Jimi's manager and producer, leaned forward. Gerald, that's the sound we're going for. The distortion is intentional. Gerald shook his head. With all due respect, Mr. Chandler, distortion is a technical error. It's not a creative choice. It's a mistake that we correct. He pressed the talk button again. Mr. Hendrix, please reduce your amplifier volume by at least half. Jimi looked at his amplifier. Then at the guitar in his hands. Then at the control room window where Gerald sat with his arms crossed, surrounded by meters and dials and the accumulated certainty of 15 years telling him what was right. Jimi stood up. Walked slowly to his amplifier. Reached down. And unplugged it. The sudden absence of the amplifier's low hum felt like a held breath. Everyone in the studio noticed, the session musicians in the corner, the assistant engineer adjusting microphones, Chaz in the control room half rising from his chair. Jimi, what are you? Chaz started. But Jimi was walking back to his stool, the unplugged cable trailing behind him across the wooden floor. He sat down. Positioned the guitar across his lap. Looked up at the control room window. No volume, he said quietly. His voice was calm. Almost gentle. That's what you want, right? Gerald's face showed confusion. I didn't say no volume, I said. Can you hear this? Jimi interrupted, and his fingers moved across the strings. The sound was barely there. Just the acoustic resonance of the Stratocaster's body, the soft metallic whisper of fingers sliding across frets, the tiny percussion of fingertips against wood. Without amplification, the guitar was almost silent in the large studio space. But something about it made everyone stop moving. Jimi didn't raise his voice. He never needed to. For 30 seconds he played. Soft. Precise. Each note deliberate and clear despite having no volume behind it. The melody was simple, almost childlike in its purity, but the spaces between the notes held something else. Intention. Weight. Purpose. Gerald sat in the control room, his hand frozen on the fader he'd been about to adjust. He'd spent 15 years recording music. He knew theory. He knew frequencies and decibels and harmonic overtones. He knew everything about sound. But he'd never actually listened like this. Jimi's fingers moved across the fretboard with such precision that even without amplification, you could hear the music in your mind, could fill in the missing volume, the absent distortion, the layers that should have been there. He was showing them the architecture beneath the sound. The skeleton that held everything together. The session musicians had put down their instruments. They were leaning forward, straining to hear, and in that straining, they were paying attention in a way they hadn't before. Jimi played for 3 minutes, never raising his head, never acknowledging the audience. Just him and the guitar and the space between silence and sound. When he stopped, the studio stayed quiet. Gerald cleared his throat. That was... I could barely hear it. Jimi looked up. But you listened. The words hung in the air. 4 syllables. But they carried the weight of something much larger. When it's loud, Jimi continued, still in that same quiet voice, you hear the sound. When it's soft, you listen to the music. There's a difference. Gerald opened his mouth. Closed it. 15 years of certainty suddenly feeling less certain. The distortion you're worried about, Jimi said, isn't a mistake. It's tension. It's pain. It's all the things that make the quiet parts mean something. Without the loud, the soft is just nothing. Without the rough, the smooth doesn't exist. He stood up, walked back to the amplifier, and plugged it back in. The hum returned. That electric potential. So you can record it how you want, Jimi said, settling back onto his stool. Clean and proper and technically perfect. Or you can record what I'm actually playing. He looked at Gerald through the control room window. Not challenging. Not aggressive. Just waiting. Subscribe and leave a comment. Because the meaning of this moment is still unfolding. Gerald Morrison stared at the young guitarist on the other side of the glass. 3 hours ago, he'd been certain this session was being ruined by an amateur who didn't understand basic recording principles. Now he wasn't certain of anything. Gerald's voice was quieter now. Let's try it your way. The session ran until 4 in the morning. Gerald stopped asking Jimi to turn down. Instead, he started asking questions. How did you get that sound? What are you doing with your fingers there? Why does that note feel different from the others even though it's the same pitch? And Jimi answered, patiently, showing him the small movements that created massive changes. The way a string bent a quarter tone could shift an entire chord's emotional weight. The way intentional feedback could become melody rather than noise. By 3 a.m., Gerald was no longer sitting in his chair making adjustments. He was standing at the window, watching Jimi's hands, trying to understand how someone could make a guitar sound like it was crying, laughing, screaming, and whispering all within the same phrase. The other musicians had stopped playing their own parts. They just watched. Even Chaz, who'd seen Jimi play 100 times, found himself transfixed by something in this particular session. Something about the way Jimi had turned that moment, that challenge, that no volume demand, into a teaching moment without ever saying, I'm going to teach you something now. During a break around 3:30, Gerald came out of the control room. He walked up to where Jimi sat, still on that wooden stool, the unplugged cable now coiled neatly beside his amplifier. Mr. Hendrix, Gerald said, I owe you an apology. Jimi looked up. For what? I've been recording music for 15 years. I thought I understood sound. But I was just managing frequencies. I wasn't actually listening to what you were trying to say. Jimi smiled. Not triumphant. Just warm. You were doing your job. Making sure the equipment worked right. That matters too. But I was so focused on the equipment that I forgot about. Gerald gestured vaguely, trying to find words. The reason. Jimi finished for him. Equipment is how. But you gotta know why first. Gerald nodded slowly. Can I ask you something? Sure. When I told you to turn down, you could have just argued with me. Told me I was wrong. But instead you unplugged completely. Why? Jimi looked at his guitar. Because sometimes you gotta take everything away to show people what's actually there. If I just turned down a little, you would have still been listening to the volume. But with no volume at all, you had to listen to something else. The music itself. The intention, Jimi corrected gently. Music is just organized air. Intention is what makes it mean something. In that quiet moment, Hendrix did something no one expected. Before the session ended, Jimi did something he'd never done before. He asked Gerald to sit at the guitar. "I don't play." Gerald protested. "Doesn't matter. Sit." Gerald sat on the stool, holding the Stratocaster awkwardly. Jimi stood beside him, adjusting his grip, positioning his fingers on the fretboard. "Don't try to play a song," Jimi said. "Just find one note. Any note. And play it like you mean it." Gerald pressed a string. The amplifier was still on, but turned down to a whisper. The note that came out was tentative. "Uncertain." "Again," Jimi said. "But this time, before you play it, know why you're playing it." "I don't understand. Are you playing it to make sound? Or to say something?" Gerald sat there, finger on the string, thinking. Then he pressed again. The note was the same pitch, same duration, but somehow different. Fuller. "There," Jimi said softly. "That's the difference. You felt that, right?" Gerald nodded, unable to speak. "That's all music is," Jimi continued. "That feeling. Everything else, the volume, the technique, the distortion, the perfection, it's all just ways to make that feeling louder. But the feeling comes first." He took the guitar back gently. "You can't engineer that into existence. You can only capture it when it's already there." The session ended at 4:15 a.m. As everyone packed up equipment and wound cables, Gerald stood in the control room doorway, watching Jimi case his guitar with the same careful attention he gave to playing it. "Mr. Hendrix," Gerald called out. "Thank you." Jimi looked up. "For what?" "For not making me feel small. You could have. You had every right to. But instead you taught me something without making it feel like a lesson." Jimi shrugged, smiling. "Man, I'm learning too. Every day. That's the whole point." He finished securing his guitar case. "Besides, you weren't wrong about the distortion being too much. You were just wrong about what to do about it." "What do you mean?" "You wanted me to reduce it. But maybe the answer wasn't less distortion. Maybe it was more intention." He tapped his chest. "The equipment can only do what we tell it to. If we're not clear about what we're trying to say, turning it down or up won't fix it." What followed stayed with everyone in the room. Long after the last note faded. 2 weeks later, Gerald Morrison came to another Jimi Hendrix session. Chaz was surprised to see him. Gerald didn't usually request specific artists. But Gerald stood in the control room, and this time he didn't touch a single fader until Jimi was finished playing. When the last note faded, Gerald leaned into the microphone. "That was perfect." Jimi looked up. "You sure? We can try again." "No," Gerald said quietly. "I heard what you were saying." Years later, Gerald would tell other engineers about that night. About the unplugged amplifier, and the lesson learned in silence. He kept the coiled cable from that session. Jimi had left it behind, mounted in a small frame in his home studio. Beneath it, a small card in his own handwriting. "Listen for intention, not just sound." Share and subscribe. Some stories deserve to be remembered. Jimi Hendrix never mentioned that night in interviews. He didn't need to. The people who were there knew what happened. And slowly, quietly, they changed how they listened to music. Gerald Morrison recorded hundreds of sessions after that. But he never again confused volume with meaning. The unplugged cable remains. A reminder that sometimes, the most powerful thing a master can do is take everything away and show you what's actually there. 3 months after that session, a young guitarist visited Olympic Studios for his first professional recording. Nervous, insecure, playing too loud to cover his fear. Gerald stopped him mid-take, walked into the studio, and unplugged his amplifier. "What are you doing?" the guitarist asked, confused. "Something someone taught me," Gerald said. "Play one note. Just one. And make it mean something." The technique spread quietly through London studios. Engineers who'd heard the story from Gerald. Musicians who'd been in that room. No one called it the Hendrix method. That would have been too loud, too obvious. They just called it listening. And 40 years later, when digital recording made every technical imperfection correctable, when auto-tune could fix any mistake and compression could make everything equally loud, there were still engineers who kept a coiled cable in their studios. Who understood that perfection without intention is just noise at any volume. Jimi never kept that cable. He didn't need physical reminders of the lessons he taught. He carried them differently, in every note he played after, in every engineer he worked with who learned to listen instead of just hear. Mastery isn't about having all the power. It's about knowing when to unplug completely and let silence teach what volume never could.